Last week, I gave a fairly comprehensive update on what we know at the moment in the light of government decisions. That's available on the FIEC website for you to be able to watch. There's not a huge amount to be able to add to that, and certainly not a great deal more in terms of clarification and certainty as we seek to make decisions. So just a few things to highlight to you as we head towards the 19th of July. Obviously, most importantly, the Prime Minister's press conference earlier this week made clear that we will be entering into step 4 in England from the 19th of July. That means the 25th of July will be the first Sunday in which the legal restrictions on COVID no longer apply to churches. But I think what it's important to note is there's a very significant change of tone in the way that government is speaking. Our personal responsibility is now seen not so much in terms of freedom, but the ability to be able to be cautious as we come out of this COVID period. The figures in terms of infections, hospitalizations and death seem to have been considerably worse than the models adopted by SAGE were saying, and therefore there's been a strong emphasis on the need to be gradual. Government has kind of emphasised the importance of wearing face masks in enclosed spaces. Vaccine passports are being recommended for various venues. I think that we're going to see inconsistency across society. It's clear that there are going to be some venues that will be insisting on people requiring face masks and refusing admission to those who don't. Some transport companies are already doing that. Transport for London have announced that wearing a face covering will be a condition of carriage. Other train companies have said that they won't be doing that. I think that churches that are using rented premises will possibly face restrictions that are being imposed by those who own the premises, whether that be schools, theatres, cinemas, or other churches. You might not be free to simply make your own decisions about that. Clearly in Scotland, masks are going to remain mandatory for some significant period of time. We need to remember that there are something like 3.7 million clinically vulnerable people in the UK. Obviously, they've got particular concerns about the additional risks of COVID. And I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to get surveys from pubs, restaurants and others, basically asking what is your opinion on what measures we should be introducing, what will make you feel comfortable to come back. And I think that's perhaps an interesting model for churches as to whether we're asking our congregations and taking the temperature of what people are feeling about measures that we might be wanting to introduce. The specific guidance for places of worship has not yet been produced, which is what's making it very difficult for churches at this particular point. So the Church of England website makes clear that the sort of places of worship task force is meeting this week to talk about what the guidance will be to churches. And that means there are no specific answers yet in guidance on the key issues for churches of social distancing, face masks and singing. And it's notable that none of the major denominations have produced updated guidance for churches yet, because they simply can't do it until that government guidance is adopted. It's clear that even though the law is being repealed in terms of COVID restrictions, that doesn't take away from church leaders' health and safety responsibilities. There was an interview on the Today programme this morning, particularly in the context of offices and people returning to the office, where I think it was helpfully pointed out that COVID law changes, but the health and safety responsibility and law doesn't. In other words, you still have a responsibility to do what is reasonable to provide a safe environment for your employees and for those who are coming on to your premises. That's what's influencing some of the decisions that are being made by shops and transport companies. By next week, we will be in a much clearer position because the places of worship guidance will have been published. I'm not expecting that much before the 19th of July. So I don't think we'll get that until pretty much down to the wire. But by the time we're kind of meeting next Wednesday for our webinar on the 21st, that will be available, and we'll be devoting that webinar to reflecting on what the specific COVID guidance for places of worship means for churches. So hopefully that will help us to plan ahead for Sunday, the 25th. Personally, I think in our church, we've adopted the view of telling our church members to sort of think that nothing is going to change. Don't assume that things are going to change, and we'll update you on what might change after the 19th when there's clarity as to what that position is. Phil, do we want to move to questions?
let's just ask this one to begin with. John, church leaders might be tempted to throw everything out for the 25th. You know, all the restrictions have been lifted. Perhaps they are in what George described as that fourth group of, you know, let's forget about the virus, let's go back to how things were. Obviously, that is a strategy. Is that a wise strategy, John?
Well, I think if you're in a church where everybody in your church thinks that, and you're in a low area of COVID, that might be what you're able to do, because you won't have issues of unity within the congregation, and you might say this is a very low area of infection. The reality is you can't just throw everything out without thinking carefully about a risk assessment that you need to undertake, that you need to own as a leadership of a church. So I think there are legal responsibilities that church leaders bear, which is that they've got to exercise appropriate caution, comply with the health and safety requirements. We don't yet know exactly what guidance the government is going to produce. When the government does produce that guidance, we don't quite know what the insurance companies will do in relation to that guidance. Obviously, I think contextually, it depends upon what your area is like and what your congregation is like. So is your area an area of high infection or low infection rates? Is it an area in which lots of people are vaccinated, or for cultural or ethical reasons, a very small number of people kind of vaccinated? So there are all sorts of questions about judgments of what's reasonable to protect people. And then, of course, there's the issue on top of that of what makes for church unity and enables people to be able to come together to worship together and join together in mission. So I think whatever your position might be, we all have a default, I'd love to do this. But the reality is the I'd love to do this has got to be integrated within that framework of what you're legally required to do as particularly church leaders and trustees on whom responsibility falls, and what makes for the unity of your church in your particular context. And in many ways, that's the great blessing of FIEC. That's an individual decision that each local church has got to make for itself. All I'm really saying is you've got to take those factors into consideration rather than simply saying our principled position is simply to overthrow everything. You'd at the very least have got to demonstrate why that is a reasonable thing to do in your context.
Thanks, John. In terms of test and trace, if churches begin singing again on the 25th, are they, if there's a positive case, are we likely to see the threshold increase then of people who might have to self-isolate if singing has happened in perhaps a way that they wouldn't have had to before? Do you think that's likely?
I don't quite know what the government guidance is going to be. My guess is that the government will say that if you're singing, you will need to be more cautious than if you're not singing because of the potential added risks of spreading the virus, certainly inside in an enclosed space. But we're going to have to wait and see what the guidance precisely is in relation to singing. And there's been no noise and no indications of what that will be. So that's kind of one element in relation to sort of singing that I think we've got to bear in mind. Can you remind me what the question was? Because there's a second element as well.
Yeah, so if particles are spreading as people are singing, if then the positive case, is it likely that that threshold increases?
Yeah, test and trace. And one of the interesting things about the change of the law is it won't be a legal requirement, I think, to take people's details for test and trace. Again, I think we'll need to look carefully at what the guidance says in relation to the responsibility of churches. And I suspect, again, from a church perspective, if we have people in our congregation who do test positive, then we will want to be contacting other members of the congregation so that they know that they have perhaps been exposed. So irrespective of the legal responsibilities of test and trace, there are issues of pastoral care and concern as to what to do in a congregation if somebody tests positive.
John, you mentioned rented premises, churches that rent spaces for worship. Do you think it's likely that the rented spaces will look at the places of worship guidelines if churches are using them, or will they come up with their own sort of recommendations that churches then will have to abide by?
I don't know the answer to that. I would imagine that venues that are renting will have generic principles for all of the people who use their premises. So I'm not sure they'll be looking specifically at places of worship. I would imagine that many of them will adopt a set of protocols for the use of rented premises that are applied to everybody who uses those premises, which may mean that churches are unlikely to get special treatment because, of course, what they're concerned about is clarity for everybody and maybe multiple groups using the premises over the period of a week or even within the period of a day. So I think we'll have to wait and see what that is. Again, we as a church use a church hall, a different church's church hall. Their leaders are getting together to meet to decide what criteria they will impose for people using their premises. That might limit, for example, the numbers of people we're allowed to have in the hall, whatever view we might want to take of that. And I think if you're renting in this situation, the venue owner has the absolute right to do that, because they're making judgments for themselves as to what they think is appropriate given their health and safety responsibilities.
That's all the questions, John. Thank you. Back to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and hope to see you next week.